This is a side event organized by Renewable Energy Institute, focusing on future prospects of renewable energy policy in Asia, maximize renewable power market. Thank you for joining this event. I am Masaya Ishida, Senior Manager of Renewable Energy Institute, and I'm very honored to be the moderator of this event. Today we have wonderful speakers from around the world. And first, I would like to introduce Thomas Corberio, Chair of Executive Board, Renewable Energy Institute. He makes welcome and open remarks. Thomas, please.
Thank you. One may be keen to see an increase in renewable energy for several different reasons. And I would like to emphasize that with the development that we have seen in the last 2 years, it is now also something that is of significant interest for those who want low-cost electricity that also fulfill many other societal purposes. Since 2016, the cost of solar and wind power has dropped dramatically. It has been made visible in the world because some countries and companies have done procurement of new electricity generating capacities where the lowest bid options have been granted the contracts and the results have been published. In Morocco, a contract awarded in 2016 reached as low as $30 per megawatt hour, which at the time was seen as extremely cheap. In the coming years, several auctions resulted in even lower cost, and I think still the world record for wind power onshore is a contract in Mexico at less than $18 per megawatt hour. I know when I show this in different countries with different currencies, when people recalculate it, they don't believe the result when they recalculate it, but this is very cheap indeed. Offshore wind has an enormous potential, but has been seen as very expensive. In Northern Europe, a set of auctions resulted in lower and lower costs. In 2016, in July, Danish company Dong, previously an oil company, now mainly an offshore wind company called Ørsted nowadays, they won this auction at a price of 72 euros per megawatt hour, which at the time was called record low. The following month, in August, nothing happened in Northern Europe, but in September there was another auction concluded in Denmark, where Vattenfall won the contract for offshore wind at 60 euros per megawatt hour. That's 10 euros lower just after 2 months. Nothing happened in October, but in November, Vattenfall won a bid off the Danish East Coast at Kriegers Flak at less than 50 euros per megawatt hour. So prices for offshore wind dropped by 10 euros per megawatt hour every second month. If it had continued like that, offshore wind would have been for free by the summer of 2017. But in this case, extrapolation was not justified. Cost did not fall that fast. But what did happen in the spring of 2017 was that for the first time, offshore wind was offered by Dong and Energie Baden-Württemberg of the German North Sea coast, where they said they would develop the wind power plants and provide electricity, and they did not need any subsidies. They would earn the money they needed by outcompeting other power plants on the German spot market. And that was seen as quite sensational at the time, but a little later the Dutch government actually offered offshore areas for wind power development and said they did not expect those who made bids to ask for subsidies. They would just show that they were big and reliable, they promised to produce a lot of electricity, and they promised to pay enormous fines if they did not fulfill the obligations after winning the competition. And Vattenfall won such a competition in the Netherlands in early 2018. So that's the development on wind power in the world in the last 3 years. Solar has followed a just as impressive cost trend. Here in 2016, in February, we had a price of below $5 per megawatt hour, or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. A few months later, in May, we had a price below 3, and then 2.5, then almost as low as 2, then for the first time below $2 per megawatt hour, below 18, and now, as the lowest bid in Portugal a couple of months ago was actually below 1.5 euro cent per kilowatt hour, and we had a similar contract in Dubai. So costs have come down dramatically. It's a result of industrial learning from experience. It's not a matter of scientific achievements, it's more of industrial learning. What you could suspect was that these low solar prices were from countries where the solar radiation was particularly high. But even in Northern Europe, where solar radiation is about half of what it is in Latin America or the Middle East, where the best contracts are achieved, have followed an almost identical cost trend, where the prices have been about twice the prices in the areas with twice as much solar radiation, which is just what you expect, and costs have come down below 4 euro cents per kilowatt hour, and now also solar onshore as far north as Berlin is to be built without any subsidies. And Germany has less solar radiation than Korea, so prices here should be possible to be even lower. It's industrial learning. It's a matter of the global industry having had the opportunity to practice, and we can see that also in the global trends on how much has been built of solar and wind. This is the wind power development curve that outpaced what most or anyone expected in the 20th century, at least in the first 10 years of this century. In 2015, wind power installations globally in capacity, not in electricity generated, but in capacity, passed that of nuclear power. Solar is increasing at an even more impressive relative growth rate, and the nuclear capacity was passed in 2017. In some countries in Asia, it's now claimed that it's difficult for stability reasons to have large shares of renewables, and that was something that was also claimed by the vertically integrated power companies in Europe in the early 1990s. Here is an advertisement by the German power companies who at that time wanted to build nuclear power. They said that renewable energy such as solar, hydro and wind can in the long run not provide more than 4% of our electricity demand. That is obviously wrong, as even Germany now has 38% of electricity from renewables, and solar alone is supplying 8%. And the most entertaining and obvious illustration of how this was wrong is from Denmark, where the power companies who were in the 1980s and early 1990s, again vertically integrated, managed to claim that you could not have more than 4%. The Danish politicians believed them and stopped the support for wind power when they reached 4%. But then something happened. That was that you had unbundling of the grid ownership and the responsibility for providing stable electricity on the grid on the one hand, and the ownership of the large power plants on the other hand. And then suddenly the new grid company that was not integrated into the electricity generating business, but just keeping the supply stable, they did not see a stability problem. The stability problem lay with the old coal-fired power stations in Denmark, and with an independent grid operator, you could start increasing wind power again. And now wind is more than 40% of the Danish electricity supply, and the grid is just as stable as ever. Unlike what some people are claiming in Japan, for example, Germany's energy transition has gone very well without increasing the dependence on fossil fuels. You can see that the share of nuclear plus renewables has continued to increase despite the fact that a lot of nuclear power has been decommissioned. And at the same time, the electricity generation in Germany has outpaced demand, so the exports have increased. It's interesting to look at, if you divide up the renewables, that in the first 6 months of this year, wind power was the largest source of electricity in Germany. And as you can see, well above 4% also. So a transition to significant shares of renewables is now the cheapest way of increasing the electricity generating capacity, and there are no technical reasons why you cannot have a large share of renewables, and it will in the longer run be important for the national economic development and competitiveness that you succeed in developing renewables as an energy supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. We see dramatic cost reductions of solar and wind in many countries and renewable expansion, while several regions are relatively slow to deploy renewable energy and struggling with the hurdles and issues to overcome. Today we have 6 speakers, and I would ask each speaker to make a short presentation to cover, the first 3 speakers cover global trends, and the next 3 speakers cover specific regional topics, particularly for Korea and Japan. So the first speaker is Paolo Franco, head of Renewable Energy Division of IEA. Paolo has been leading the Renewable Energy Group of IEA for more than 10 years. And he will talk about the latest study by IEA, just published today? Yesterday.
So indeed, Thomas showed us many very interesting data, mainly about the past. I would like to go 5 years in advance. And I would like very shortly to show you 3 slides in an informal way, because the official launch today is just at 4:30 in another side event, where of course you are all cordially invited. Now, the first thing, if you look at the growth of renewables in the next 5 years, it's like this, with offshore wind actually tripling the capacity. It is still small, but it's going very, very fast. Don't forget hydropower. Many people tend to think hydropower is not finished, but has exploited all the potential. This is absolutely not true. Onshore wind is accelerating again growth after a couple of years of problematic growth, and then comes solar. So this is what we see happening in the next 5 years with solar PV in the world. And this part is distributed PV, which is actually the focus of our market report this year. I will go much more in detail at 4:30, but I think it is very relevant also for this discussion because a number of installations in countries where there is a high population density and no very much surface, which includes Korea and Japan and Italy, by the way, yes, we are exactly in the same situation. There, distributed PV can play a major role to use surfaces that are used for other purposes. So as you can see here, Distributed PV in our forecast is set to grow more than wind onshore in the world, just distributed. And then the rest is large-scale PV in places where space is not an issue. There are many of those places. Now, on distributed, mainly when people think about distributed PV, indeed they think about rooftop solar on the houses. Rightly so, because indeed, in 5 years from now, we estimate that around 100 million roofs will have a PV, and in some regions in the world, it's literally 1 over 2 houses, like in some Australian states, where the situation is a lot of PV on houses. And in some parts of countries like Japan or Italy, this is also the case. But what is neglected in terms of capacity, it is the part which is in industrial and commercial sites. And this will be actually the dominating part, and with very good reasons. Because everywhere in the world, the match between PV supply and demand is better in commercial and industrial installations. So you take a supermarket, an hotel, or a commerce, or whatever, they will always have a big demand during the day. While if you're not at home, obviously you're not consuming electricity. And this is much better for system integration, which is indeed emerging as an important challenge. I totally agree with Thomas, and I would like to repeat it very clearly. There is no technical limit to variable renewables penetration in the system. They could also be we could run a system 100% of wind and solar. It is economic factors that can limit this, but certainly not a technical factor, despite what many utilities have been saying in many years ago. Now it's better, but indeed, from time to time, you still hear fake news about variable renewables. Now, my last slide is about costs. And I've chosen not to show the auctions, which are a very important part, but the other part, which is the distributed part. So the other advantage, of course, of distributed PV is that you compete with retail electricity prices, and retail electricity prices are usually much higher than the wholesale. Now, retail electricity prices are very different across countries. Denmark and Germany have the highest in the world. Japan has also high prices. Some IEA countries have high prices. Of course, in more developing economies, prices of residential are much lower because it's a subsidized, it's for social reasons. And some Asian countries have a situation which is in between. Now, in 2018, if you compare the levelized cost of electricity generation of distributed PV with these prices, you could see an enormous gap in countries like Germany, to less extent Japan, and in other countries we were not yet at a competitive, or let's say not competitive, attractive part. But in 2024, this becomes the norm basically everywhere. Basically, in most countries in the world, in 2024, the generation cost of distributed PV are comparable or lower than retail electricity prices. Now, if you then think how much is the potential, which is huge, of rooftop available surface, you can understand that this will be a major driver for renewables in the years and in the decades to come. I will not say more secret about this. I will defer to the 4:30 side event, but I would like to add this complementary information to what Thomas said. The cost, just the cost attractiveness is becoming a major driver. On top of that, if you think about air pollution in cities, the other drivers that you can put on renewables are more and more. I will stop it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paolo. I think distributed PVs, particularly rooftop solars, have not only economical benefits, but also environmental impact perspective, where renewable energy actually has some environmental impact, but rooftop solar is considered to be one of the least impact on environment. So not only economical, but also environmental. That's a driver of distributed PV around the world. Yeah. Thank you. Paolo is originally from Italy, and the next speaker is also from Italy. Emmanuel Barranco, Associate Program Officer of IRENA. Emmanuel is responsible for renewable energy policies, including power market design.
Thank you. So yes, good afternoon. I'm Emanuele Bianco. I work in IRENA in the KPFC division that deals with topics like renewable energy policies, renewable energy market, etc. Now, I would like to make this presentation about the power markets fit for the renewable energy era that is approaching and may become reality with the energy transition. In order to present the future, let me deal with a moment with the past. So renewable energy policies evolved over time, from capital grants to feed-in tariffs that put some volume risk to producer, to feed-in premiums that expose them to market price, and now to auctions that create competition between various stakeholders. And as already presented, the numbers of the prices of auction have decreased over time quite impressively. Now, we have some record results across the world. IRENA is collecting the data of all the auctions that are happening around the world, and we are going to publish a report about auctions this January. From the analysis that we make, we see that solar PV and wind in 2018 reached around $60 per megawatt hours as average price of auctions across the globe. This including the record auctions that we heard just now about, and the newcomers, countries where the prices are a little higher because this is their first experience. And as you can see, the volume auctioned are becoming more and more high. So someone could ask himself, what's next? Are auctions here to stay, or we are going to phase out completely the supporting policies? Can we just use the market as it stands now to support renewable energy that is now competitive with the rest of the fossil fuel generators, or that will become competitive with the fossil fuel generators? Now, something we have to remember, these are both variable renewable energy, and variable renewable energy, we all know that about, have very specific properties. So they are location constrained, they are non-synchronous distributed, but also variable. We cannot dispatch them properly. They are uncertain. We cannot know exactly their output until a very few minutes before the moment. And they have low short-term costs. Now, this creates some challenges in systems that were created for centralized fossil fuel generators. The current power market design has been in particular in Europe, has been designed around the idea of fossil fuel efficiency. But what to do with energy sources that do not have a fuel? And in particular, how to make sure that the variable sources always match a load that does not follow the wind or the sun. And also, and we know this very well, the presence of low short-term cost energy would decrease the price. The pricing and the pressed price is a problem for investments in the future, because why should I invest in a market that will not give me enough money back? So how can the variable renewable energy participate in a market that is not designed for them? Well, we have to remember that the power system setup needs to be fit for the characteristic of the power system they are meant to support. So we need a reform of the power market, and this is across everywhere, not only in Asia, in Europe, in America, everywhere. The characteristic of viable renewable energy needs to be implemented, needs to be understood in the power market, which, by the way, is only a construct around the thing that we are buying. So, as a solution, we have the dual market. The dual market approach is sort of a new thing, but also something that we are building over time as humanity, I would say. So the dual market approach considers the experiences across the world of two separate ways to buy electricity. From one side, you have the energy markets. An energy market that is not like the current one, but like, I would say, more similar to the Latin American experiences, meaning based on annual long-term auction, based on load forecast. So in order to meet the actual need of using renewable energy to meet the actual need of the system, designed to match demand with long-term contracts, made in order to minimize the finance cost of these technologies that are very capex intensive, and obviously recognizing the spatial and temporal value of electricity generation. This system would be used only to procure energy with long-term contract, 20 years, 15 years, from viable renewable energy. And a delivery market would be instead the evolution of the current wholesale market structures that we have, for example, in Europe, so that they are becoming more and more flexible and based on short-term dimension in order to meet the load with the net load at this point with the supply, and but also with the participation of more and more demand-side resources, distributed generators, and sector coupling. And the price could vary very much between very high and very negative, possibly with the elimination of the scarcity pricing limit, and made in order to attract the investment in flexible resources. Now, this is something that could be applied in any part of the world, both in liberalized systems, but also in regulated systems. So this is what I have today for as an introduction, and thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. The next speaker is Irene Gaynor. Irene is president of Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition, and she talks about energy transition inclusiveness. And she doesn't need to use slides.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting side event. One of the things about the energy transition is that it will happen everywhere. It needs to happen everywhere. And there are obstacles to making it inclusive everywhere. And any obstacle can also be a chance, an opportunity. And I would like to present the opportunity that the energy transition harbors of bringing more women into the energy sector everywhere. Because we know from many studies that it is good for business, it is good for the bottom line if the workforce is diversified, if the workforce can draw on all available talent. And all available talent means male and female, young and experienced, from different parts of the world, from different regions within a country, from different ethnicities. We have studies that show, studies from institutes such as the McKinsey Global Institute, which mapped equality indicators in 95 countries. And they defined what they mean by gender equality by saying equality at work, essential services and enablers of economic opportunity, legal protection and political voice, and physical security and autonomy. So that should be the same for women and men. And they have demonstrated in their studies that including a more diverse workforce, including women in positions of leadership in particular, not only improves the human rights situation, because women have a right to equal opportunities, but it also improves GDP, global GDP. They have made calculations that if every country in a particular region were to reach the gender equality of the leader in that particular region, global GDP would grow by $12 trillion per year. So a lot of economic opportunity there. But diverse leadership also leads to better results, and it means that companies are better prepared to survive financial shock. It means that they have better innovation, better investment in R&D, and make greater use of talent. It also means that companies have decreased risk and decreased overconfidence, and that again results in higher returns. McKinsey also found that including women in the workforce, in particular in leadership positions, leads to increased action by the particular company on environmental issues and decreased litigation for environmental breaches, and also for more stringent decarbonization policies. Now, taking all these elements that show how good it is for a company, for the bottom line of a company, for the environment, and for society at large to include women more equally in the energy sector, we at the Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition thought we want to work on this issue. So Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition is an NGO registered in Austria, my home country. It's a young NGO. We just created it 2.5 years ago. And it fosters networking among women. It fosters, it advocates on behalf of women's equal participation. And it provides services such as mentoring, coaching, and project development. And with funding from the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy of Germany, we embarked on a study on women in the sustainable energy sector, strategies for increased diversity and inclusion. This study is based on the review of scientific evidence. It's based on industry interviews, and it has a structural and environmental analysis of the situation. It arrives at recommendations for government, for corporate environment in general, for individual companies, and for individual people, persons. I don't have time at this moment to present the preliminary findings of this study. I will use also the opportunities of this conference to talk with as many people as I can on their own experiences and perceptions, and we hope to finalize this study shortly and present it to you all then. In the meantime, I would like to invite you to go to the website of the Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition. You will find us very easily. And you will there also find an expert platform. We have created a platform, an electronic platform for women experts in energy. feel free to register your profile there. There are already more than 700 women registered. It's a way of helping women to network, but also to help those among us who every so often search for a qualified female expert in a particular region, in a particular field, for a speaker, etc., to do a very targeted search and find a nice selection of highly qualified women. Thank you for your opportunity to present our work to you. And if there is time in the questions and answers, I'd be happy to amplify. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. From the three speakers, we learned various aspects of renewable energy to change market, industry, and society. And the next speaker is So-hee Kim, Secretary General, Climate Change Center of Korea. And So-hee covers the latest situation of renewable energy in Korea and prepares so much valuable information.
And thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me for interesting events. Actually, I'm very glad to be here to share my thoughts on the theme of today's event. I'd like to introduce Korea's situation to help your understanding, and so some suggestions are followed. But my slide notes are 15 pages for your information, but I will turn the pages quickly. So according to the IRENA's statistics, the Asia region shares 43.5% of global renewable capacity, and Korea's capacity is just only 1.2% in Asia. In 2017, renewable power still accounts for only 5% among power mix of Korea, even though it looks tiny portions, but 2017's total amount of renewable power is increased by over 3,000% compared to that of 2007. But this government has showed a favorable attitude for the renewables, so I hope the situation become better. And then among renewable powers, Korea focused on two, solar and wind power, consider the industry situations. As you see, the LCOE of solar and wind power in Korea is remarkably expensive, whereas industry electricity prices are relatively low. So consequently, discourages industry from using renewable power. So Korea's situation is totally different, unlike Paolo and Thomas' presentation. And then I will introduce some reasons for higher renewable price with example of solar power. In direct expenses, module, inverter, and construction is still higher than other countries. And among indirect expenses, approval to construction and connected to power system and consulting costs are still more expensive. And then the last but least, the biggest cause contributing to higher costs are land rent and managing civic complaint costs, which are also the main barrier to increase renewable power smoothly in Korea. As I mentioned, President Moon's government support for renewable energy. As you see, this government announced a 30-20 implementation plan, which the renewable powers accounts for 20% until 2030. And obligatory supply rate of RPS keep increasing. That means power producer more than the 500,000 kilowatt should comply with each year's target. And REC weight significantly affects the power producers' economic interest, and ESS has the highest REC weight, which means the government's will is reflected to support for ESS ESS industry. So, given the current situations, I'd like to introduce some suggestions to maximize the renewable power market in Korea. First, many experts point out that first, policy environment should be made to minimize the steps for the application renewable power facility construction to reduce the administrative expenses remarkably. And second, it is necessary to set a renewable energy price goal. That means government should set LCOE targets correspond to renewable power targets. And third, providing preferential loan could be an option, but first of all, government exerts all possible efforts to reduce public claims and complaints working together with the civil society. Unfortunately, citizens' low acceptability to renewable energy is currently the biggest obstacle to increase renewable energy power. This is mainly because of, I think, the lack of right and correct information on renewable energy in Korea. And finally, I'd like to take notice of the role of RE100 initiative, which is a global corporate voluntary initiative committed to 100% renewable electricity. According to the climate group, 155 global corporate joint members as of 2018. Japan has 13 members, China has 2 members, but Korea has no company to join the initiatives. Given the current Korea's electricity industry and market, it is hardly for corporate to join the members. So, however, global member corporate request their global suppliers to join the RE100 initiatives. So, Korea company in relevant industries such as semiconductor and battery may face a considerable difficulty in maintaining bargaining power in product exports unless satisfying the request to purchase more renewables. So as it is likely to build on invisible trade barrier in near futures, national attention should be paid to this agenda, and countermeasures are also needed to be drawn. So in response to corporate demands, recently Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy considered to introduce a green pricing system as one of the measures to purchase renewable energy. So given the current situation, I'm quite sure that RE100 initiatives could be a trigger to reform Korea's electricity industry and market, and consequently contribute to expand the renewable energy power market in East Asia. So given the time limits, I'm end up for my presentation and see the panel session.
Thank you, Sohee. We understand Korea and Japan have common issues of renewable energy, and we can learn and solve by learning each other. The next speaker is Hiroshi Takahashi, professor through University of Japan. He is one of opinion leaders in Japan on energy policies. And today he will talk about system reform in Japan.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, so I'll make a short speech without any slides. Thank you, Ishida-san. Well, so as a scholar in the energy policy, especially I've been studying on the promotional policy of the renewable energy in both in Japan and the other advanced countries for 10 years or so. now that the cost of power generation by renewable has been dramatically decreased, lowered, as Thomas explained in the first place, the conclusion is so obvious. What we should do to promote renewable energy, grid issues. The grid issues are the most important policy when you want to deploy renewable energy. Obviously, we need to have the fair grid access. Any renewable energy generators need to have the grid access. Otherwise, those electricity generated would be meaningless. They cannot sell. Also, because the portion of those variable renewable energy, such as wind and solar, has been increasing, we need to change the way of the system operation, which should be more favorable to VRE. Favorable does not mean unfairly favorable, but rather we should make, for instance, dispatching rule. We should dispatch the electricity based on merit order. Or because VRE, the ratio of VRE it has been increasing, the electricity system as a whole should have more focus on expanding the flexibility, as Emanuele explained. And those things are quite obvious, and those are what European countries have been experiencing for 10 years, 20 years so. So it is so clear for those Korean, Japanese government. It's very easy. It's very easy answer. We should just follow. Of course, there are some different contexts, but it's so obvious what we should do. However, unfortunately, the Japan situation is very far from that, very different. Yes, both wholesale and retail market has been recently liberalized. We have liberalized the market. However, grid constraint is quite high. The government has decided to unbundle the transmission business legally by 2020. That's next year. So still, Japanese electricity system is vertically integrated, except Tokyo Electric Power Company, which has unbundled legally 3 years ago. So that means there is high barrier for grid access. That's why renewable energy generators have to wait for a long time to gain the grid access. And also, in some cases, they have to pay very high cost for expanding the major transmission lines, not access lines, but major transmission lines. And even though there is more space for the existing transmission lines, so there are such many problems on the grid access which had existed in Europe too, say 20 years ago or so. And recently, Japanese incumbents, system operators have started the curtailment of the renewable energy power, even though the nationwide share of VRE is still 5 or 6%. So it is so obvious, once again, we need to change the grid opening policy as soon as possible. And yes, next year, 2020, as I said, is the deadline of the legal unbundling in Japan. So I hope next year might be one kind of trigger for the electricity system reform. And I would like to keep on watching this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Takahashi-san. Next speaker is Mika Obayashi, Director, Renewable Energy Institute. She is frequently traveling around the world and can cover any country, I think. But today she will focus on East Asia region.
Actually, I didn't suppose to prepare some slides, but I think that it's very easy to show you some slides about Japanese situation. So after the introduction of the German type of feed-in tariff back in 2012, that Japanese renewables are totally rapidly increased. That's because that we experienced the Great East earthquake, and also the Fukushima nuclear power accident. Government has started to change their energy policy. But you could see it is only the PV has risen rapidly. And then if you see the blue part of this slide, that means that wind energy, that has not been increased much. That actually that currently that we have 55.5 gigawatt of solar PV in Japan, competing with Germany and the US at the kind of a number 2 globally. But in terms of wind energy, that it's still less than 4 gigawatt. So some barriers, it's apparently that some barriers here that we have to overcome. And also another thing is, like if you see this picture that I would like to point out, government target for renewable is quite not so ambitious. So in 2030, government has that target for renewable energy as a whole, 22 to 24% in the electricity mix. But for example, for solar power, they have 7% of the target, but it's almost already reached by the solar PV, current existing solar PV in Japan. So we think that this kind of not so advanced message, actually that I didn't touch anything, but it has certainly changed. Maybe that you think that I have to be very speak up. And then, this kind of that the lower target gives a certain message to the industry, like that the government has a plan to expand that the renewable energy market in future or not. So we are urging that the government to have the more ambitious target, like 40 to 50% of renewables by 2030. And then that, as you see, it could be possible because some areas, Japan has divided into like 10 incumbent utilities areas in terms of electricity, and then those areas are basically responsible for supply and demand adjustment in the areas. And then, so you see that it's an example of Kyushu, but the Kyushu Electric last year, and then this year, of course, and then somehow the 96% of its demand in the area met by renewables, mostly by PVs. That is a kind of just a 1 hour example, but if you see that the other part of the areas as well, more than 70% of the electricity demand in 7 out of 10 service areas, electricity power market areas across Japan, that this kind of phenomena are already happening. And then this is also the one portion of the year, but this kind of trend is continue to grow because the renewable energy sources, especially PV in Japan, is increasing still. So, but, and then the cost of renewables that Paolo highlighted that we have, it has been finished. It's fine. I will start from here. So Paolo pointed out that the cost of renewables in Japan is still high, yes. But there are some kind of assumptions like IEA, like this is example of Bloomberg, that the solar will be the cheapest source of energy that in the middle of 2020. And then the right side is our assumption as well. Why it has been going, but I just don't understand. But anyway, so the government cost assumption in 2030, it's a kind of a formal government assumption cost of PV in 2030. It's still 12 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. But that according to our new studies, then that the cost of PV will decline, that currently the similar price in Europe now that we will reach coming to 10 years. That is our assumption. So that even in Japan that the cost of renewables will decline. But other element will affect to the renewable energy expansion. Expansion in Japan. That another thing, the one kind of a remarkable, why? I don't know, but I don't touch anything, but one is a kind of a coal power plant, not the nuclear, but the coal power plant that the Japanese government has a kind of a massive expansion plan of coal-fired power plant. Yeah, of course that some were canceled because of the financial issues, like the operation hours of thermal power plants are already decreasing because of the, the peak is covered by the solar PV, and also the demand itself is decreasing. So the existing thermal power plants operation hours are already decreasing, and also that brand new coal-fired power plant is some are canceled, but actually that if those unflexible electricity generation occupy the market, that it's very difficult for renewables to get into the market. So the some words of flexibility has already talked by the previous speakers, but I think that we have to change this kind of the market structure first, and then that at the same time that we have to think about that to integrate variable renewables. So, and then I just explained that what's the kind of a Japanese electricity situation facing, and then that I would like to make some comments about that. That one is like our friend at IEA, Paolo showed us that kind of a very future percentage and then increment of the renewables. But actually, like international organizations, the assumption always, behind the reality of the expansion of renewables that we saw, or the trend already. So I hope that what Pablo showed us, that will be behind the reality of the expansion of renewables. This is the one thing. And then as we already confirmed, the kind of a cost of renewables have been becoming very cheap, and then that nobody could predict this situation 10 years ago, like 2009, and then also like back in 2000, like Germany started the 6% of renewables, now in the 38% of renewables, and then 8 years ago, we started that 8% of renewables in the power mix, and now we reach 18% of the renewables in power mix. So I think that it's possible to increase the renewable energy portion dramatically by 2030. If we don't do that, it's very difficult to adapt the kind of urgency of climate change. As you see that Japan is very vulnerable country to natural disaster. So we need such kind of valuable renewable energy to get into the grid, and then this is the time that we have to change our thought. How to integrate renewable to the power market is not. How our current system, adjust the new era of the renewable energy power market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mika. I'm sure Paul has some comments about that.
If you want to start from there, I can. Let me respond like this. Even with this incredible cost decrease of wind and solar, for renewables, policies are still fundamentally important to create the right market design and the right frameworks. In 2018, as you know, the market of renewables stalled. For the first time, it was not greater than the year before. And this was due for one policy change in one country, in China, which basically stopped the expansion of PV and stopped the whole market. So I'm used to hear that the IEA is conservative, but we try to analyze critically the policies around the world, and our observation is that the policies are still not right for a real market-based expansion of renewables, despite the fact that they're becoming much more competitive. And on that, and one remark about the situation in Japan and in Korea, using one word that was not mentioned, it's competition. The main reason behind the curves that Thomas has shown, and also the figures of the cost for distributed PV. One is technology progress, but the second is competition. And what both Japan and Korea and other ASEAN countries, by the way, are enormously suffering is the lack of competition. If the governments want to be serious, are to be serious in having a the cheapest, the most economic, effective transition, then they have to create the conditions to have more competition in this region.
Any comments by Thomas or Mika?
Of course, I agree. I would just use the slightly different terminology. I would not talk about the right condition. I would talk about fair conditions and equal conditions for all power generators. And what we see in both Japan and Korea is that the dominating power company or power companies who owns and operates the old large power thermal power plants that are now being challenged by new renewable electricity generating technologies. They have advantages, they control the grid, they set rules, and they have a total control of the balancing power market. And that needs to change if the electricity generating cost and the cost of the electricity supply in general in these two countries are to be competitive in the future. I think it will change, but I think it's urgent that these changes are carried out quickly. I could add that when the electricity market reform was done in Sweden in the 1990s, and I was on the commission that did the final changes to the legislation that was introduced, our decision was that the change to a market system should be done at once. Because if you try to do it step by step, you would introduce suboptimal behavior for periods, and you would create confusion. And you would create a situation where there were very few people who understood the rules at each moment in time. I think we did the right thing. I think it worked better when you changed everything at once into a competitive system that you could successfully explain to all actors.
Yes, I totally agree with what these two gentlemen explained. And then if I think why Japan has been lagging behind is, well, Thomas said, change at once is very important. But generally speaking, Japanese people like change step by step. Gradual change we prefer. And of course, especially the government officials tend to be, favorable, or tend to favor on the gradual change, step by step, not too much radical. And so we have long history of market liberalization since 1995 or so, but it took more than 20 years to liberalize the entire market. So it's very gradual. And energy transition, that's triggered by the, of course, Fukushima nuclear power accident. So rather quick, maybe, from the Japanese standard, but still the government wants to change its energy policy step by step. So they want to keep coal-fired power plants and also nuclear power plants as well. That's why they want to spend more time to do the energy transition. So what we should do is probably we need more pressure from the industrial side or consumer side, or maybe hopefully from the more academic side. So that's what I have been doing. And of course, I'm not totally pessimistic. So what I can do is, as a scholar, I keep on, saying something and propose policies to the government and to the public.
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up on some of the things that were said, and in my capacity as vice president of REN 21, also do a little bit of publicity for the Renewable Energy Status Report for Asia, which is being launched in another room as we speak. And just ask the question, about energy security in the region. Obviously, both Korea and Japan and also other countries in the region import a lot of fossil fuels, which always contains an element of insecurity. In Europe, we have the same situation because we import a lot, in particular also from volatile partners. So that's the one thing, the energy security situation, how that is being seen by the experts for the region. And the second, also the mega cities that you have. I mean, in Asia has lots of very big cities. Isn't there also a great potential for advancing the energy transition in these cities, doing something about transport, etc.? And the third element also, how do the regional energy cooperation mechanisms that exist, how do they help or don't they help or to accelerate the energy transition? Thank you.
Sophie, can you make some comments? I have prepared several questions, but the discussions are already active and dynamic. So.
I just want to add after the Japan's Korea's situation, borrowing the Paolo's comments, I want to take the word. My conclusion is that this government doesn't take this low carbon energy transition, doesn't take that serious. Even though this government, as I mentioned, this government announced 30-20 targets, but they don't give any signal to the coal power plants and the nuclear energy power plants. So, during 4 years, for this government, during 4 years, over 10 coal power plants is constructed, and then those coal power plants approved by a former government. Even though this current government criticized the former government, they should give another pricing signal to page out the coal power plants, such as a carbon tax or a carbon trading system in Korea is adopted from the 2015. So given the current situation, I'm from the civil society, so I don't want to depend the Korean government. So that's why we all think that this government take the climate change issue doesn't take the serious. So, and then regarding the energy security, we all think that Korea is kind of an island, not like European countries. So as I know, the Japan and Korea and the Russian and Mongolians still keep talking about the kind of integrated, connected electricity system. So I just ask the kind of a suggestion from the IEA or IRENA. So those kind of interconnected from the East Asia's interconnected electric system could benefit, but it will take time to implement those systems. But from perspective of Korea, it is very important to interconnect it to the electric system and to expand the renewable energy market.
Would you give us some recommendations or suggestions? And after that, we're going to
Yeah.
take questions
So-
from the audience.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the energy policies in Korea and also but mostly in Japan are based on the, yes, they have some targets for decarbonization, but the idea is based on technical excellence, industrial growth, and all these things are at odds with the energy transition, which instead has as a prime elements energy efficiency, social inclusion, and the use of distributed energy. And so my idea and what we can learn by also reading Irina's studies is that the energy transition calls for an holistic view. So an energy-only policy will always fail to achieve this new energy transition if it doesn't include a lot of elements that are usually outside our little world. So labor policy, land policies. If your land policies is an old law that does not, that increase the rent of your land, even for solar PV that is needed for your country, then something is wrong outside the energy sector. And so the suggestion would be, maybe it's important to understand the effect of this energy transition, how many new jobs will be created, how much the air pollution will decrease, how much the effect on health, the effect on the GDP, which every scenario shows an increase in GDP with the energy transition. Once you have all these elements, you can restructure your entire industrial, energy, and labor policies for the energy transition, and they could be successful. Germany attempted that in the past, and it worked somehow. So,
I totally agree with it.
Can I make some just quick comments about the kind of energy security and cities initiatives? And in terms of energy security, you may understand Japan has a very, how can I say, the conservative energy security thinking. So that they that have the fossil fuel imported from the other countries and sticking on the nuclear power, saying it as a primary energy source of Japan. So, but as Irina mentioned about energy security is a different dimension of the energy security, I think. That of course that renewable energy gives the huge energy security to the country. So we believe like Japan could be an energy rich country rather than an energy poor country if we promote that renewables. Especially Japan is a very unique situation that we are a developed country, but we have a lot of natural resources in the country. So it's a really different from European countries. So we can utilize that. And then about the cities initiatives, yes, like Tokyo Metropolitan Government, which is the biggest city in Japan, and they have the very good initiative to increase the renewables, and then they have the kind of a climate change target. They will reach the kind of carbon neutrality by 2050. So that, I think Japanese situation is rather very similar like US situation. Like government national policy is not so much set, but each actors like local communities and local authorities, and then now the corporations declaring renewable 100 target or something that we are good together to go for climate change target as well as the increase of renewables. So that is a kind of a non-state actors positions are now active in Japan, but of course it's not enough, and then it's slow. So we have to change the core policy first, but go together with that we can do that. And then actually there is a kind of a person that who is in charge of Korean renewable energy policy is here, but maybe that he wants to say something about it to you that maybe you know each other very well. But I believe that together with Korean government, the Japanese government also could have the renewable energy, how can I say, expansion. And then you mentioned about interconnector. It's true that we need to have the flexibility of a domestic transmission system, but I think that it has to be the same time, not first, the domestic transmission system. Because interconnector, for example, like Korea and Japan, it will go fast, very fast, if the government if the Japanese government decide to go ahead. So it could be very fast to be integrated. And then that will give the kind of a huge impact to domestic power sector in Japan. So we are promoting the interconnector as well.
We have only 10 minutes left, and I would like to take questions from the audience. The front row, gentlemen. Yes. Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
I have only 2 points. The first point, Japan has now more PV capacities than Germany, so this is very impressive. On the other hand, I hear about barriers, high cost, etc. Do the companies write red numbers in this dealing PV in Japan? And the second point might be more important. One breakthrough in Germany for the German energy transition was not the energy policy. It was the 4 major energy suppliers recognized that some years ago that coal-linked electricity has no future. And utilities in general have no interest for short-term business, also not for mid-term business. They have an interest for long-term business. And my question is about the Japanese electricity suppliers. Do they not recognize that beyond current energy policy, which follows sometimes business policies, business orientations? Do they have no vision that coal-linked or fossil fuel-linked business has no future, in particular in times of climate change? Also, Japan is very much affected by climate change impacts. We have heard this 2 weeks ago. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Paul?
A very short answer. I mean, it is true that this was a turning point, but the German utilities were under the competition of the European competitors. And here they don't have competition. So they can continue to do their vision whatever they want. If there is no pressure on climate change, there is not a carbon price, society is undecided because it's not necessarily underinformed. I think the European story is quite different, and the fundamental point was the unbundling. Because this has changed, the market liberalization in Europe has made a big difference. The German utilities were quite late compared to other utilities, but at some point it was very evident also to them that they had to change. I would say that in these 2 countries, and I would even add Thailand, Indonesia, and all the Asian situation, they are not yet there because they have not enough pressure and not enough competition.
If I may add, Paolo is right when he said that there is no pressure to change, but the pressure can be created also by in a vertically integrated, fully regulated system if the paradigm changes. Because if today, like in Indonesia, the main activity is to provide electricity at a low price, self-produced and self-consumed, with very low import, which, by the way, hamper the business case for interconnectors. You can have a system that add liberalization and efficiency of fuels. And then you have liberalized markets like in Europe, but still they may have no pressure to go for renewable energy if you don't add some elements that ask for the decarbonization. And this can happen also for in a regulated world. Once the rules is there that they have to achieve that, things will move, can move quite fastly, even without competition.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't, just 1 second, China is a perfect example for this. But you need to have a very strong government which is independent from industrial lobbies and which take this decision. I mean, this, yeah, but I don't, sorry, yeah, not yet. We are not yet at this point.
Your description of how the German power companies understood that nuclear and coal did not have a future also include some quite dramatic impairments of the asset value of these coal and nuclear power plants in their balance sheets. And in the end, even some of the European power companies were very close to bankruptcy. RWE really struggled. The situation is even worse in Japan, especially with the nuclear liabilities that have not been accounted for and the way that even spent fuel is considered an asset in many balance sheets. So that's rather different. Why the Japanese power companies accepted that solar was increasing was because of the way they were allowed to manage the feed-in tariffs in relation to the customers. They paid for the solar electricity, and then they charge the customers the difference between what they paid for the solar electricity and their average generating cost. And the cost they saved was their marginal generating cost. So the power companies earned a lot of money on solar, which reduced the use of the most expensive electricity generation, and they were able to charge the customer more than they increased their costs, so they actually profited from it. With wind and now additional solar, they don't do that anymore, and they don't like it.
I'd just like to thank Paolo for rescuing IEA from irrelevance, and also maybe one day we can have IENA. Yeah, anyway, it's a bad joke. Okay. Irene, IEA plus IRENA. Okay. Anyway, this is a question. When I was reviewing the conference book for this conference, one thing that came to my mind is how renewable energy is portrayed in the Korean media. And I don't know about the Japanese media, but I know in Korea right now there's this kind of like fear gripping farmers that renewable energy is invading the countryside. And I have been in Korea for about 16 years. I've seen how the media system has been, under Lee Myung-bak, ironically, basically sold YTN to private investors and others, and brought in parachute appointments into MBC and others. And I'm wondering how the media affects, because the media has an educating function in our society, and also helps the public understand these issues. And I didn't see any panel here during this conference on the media's role in the renewable energy transition in Korea. And I have my suspicions about what's happening, but I have no evidence, so I can't say. But what I'd like to have your comments, Sohee and Hiroshi, about the power of the media to affect energy transition, and how vital it is to have a vibrant and critical media to help inform the public about energy policy.
Just simply word, currently the media doesn't work in helping the increase in renewable energy. And then the main problem we thought is that this government, from starting, this government declared page out nuclear power, and then the increasing renewable energy. So using the word page out the nuclear power is a touch at the nuclear power supporter, and then they want to fight with renewable energy supporters. So the media support nuclear power. They criticize the bad things about renewable energy. So, and then also the fake news on the renewable energy has influenced in local government. So we really think that this problem is a very serious barriers to increase the renewable energy in local government, even though the authority has a strong will to increase renewable energy. The local government has a very low acceptability in renewable energy. So we need to invest to educate the local government citizens from the bottom. Yeah, restart. Yes, we feel yeah, this problem is very serious current. Yeah.
Well, I don't know so much about the Korean situation, but from what I hear from Sohee, Japanese situation is probably better because we experienced the Fukushima nuclear power accident. So, of course, before that, the media might have quite a one-sided view, but after that, generally speaking, those right-wing type of media said nuclear is still important and renewable is not reliable. But those left-wing type of media said nuclear is very bad, very risky, and renewables are very promising, and we need it in the future. So generally speaking, Japanese people can get the necessary information from both sides. So generally speaking, the situation might be better. And as you said, yes, media has very influential role, it's very influential and in the policy making and also public opinion. And generally speaking, more than half of Japanese people are pro renewables, and we don't like nuclear anymore. But the existing government, which is highly supported by the people, have a rather conservative, traditional type of the energy policy. So that's the situation.
Like to add one situation. It's not the right or left, but actually the middle or something, like a kind of industry newspaper like FT equal in Japan is Nikkei. Nikkei has changed their policy, and then they are just, not promoting renewables, that they are becoming fair to adapt the renewable energy market. So it's a kind of an economic thing, not a kind of a, how can I say, the philosophy or something. So it's really economical to integrate renewables into Japanese market. That is a kind of a current sense of the media in Japan. But still, as Hiro-san said, that some part of Japanese media very hard for pushing the renewable is a kind of a negative and unreliable, expensive, or those kind of information. So the media work is quite important, I think.
In Cheongnam right now, there's a climate conference. It says with Ban Ki-moon, who is also here, and tomorrow. So he's coming from Cheongnam to here tomorrow, and they just said Justin Gui, a renewable energy expert, says that South Korea will shut down 40% of the country's coal plants this winter to clean up the air.
Temporarily.
Temporarily.
Yeah, temporarily
okay.
to just to respond to the particle issue during the summer, during the spring and the autumn season. Not
permanently.
Not permanently page out plant. There is no page out plans, honestly.
Not yet.
Yeah.
I have heard though that Korean coal plants are unable to get new coal plants are unable to get insured. And for example, the insurance industry in Korea is starting to get scared that they're going to be insuring stranded assets. Mm-hmm. And for example, they still, like Uri Eunheng and other banks, are insuring coal plants in Indonesia. But they're not going to insure any more coal plants in South Korea. And I wonder, and also in Japan, I've heard the same thing is starting to happen.
Yeah, I know that some banking group or a pension fund invested former time, not current time.
Uh-huh.
According to the kind of evaluation guide, the banking group and pension fund can't invest coal power plant project because given the price of the coal power plant's price, it's very economical benefits to the company. So the banking group can't invest because of the economic benefits. They can provide a project fund, but former time, not now. So usually to implement the coal power plant in 5 or 7 years, the current in constructions of coal power plant is approved 5 years ago or 7 years ago.
Okay.
Okay.
I see. Thank you.
Okay. So yes.
So the Japanese government is supporting, for example, exporting the so-called efficient coal-fired power plant, and then that some banks and the investors that already announced that they will not finance the coming additional coal-fired power, but excluding that so-called clean coal technology. So.
Okay. So sorry, but the time is over. And the discussions are very exciting. And I would appreciate all the audiences coming to this event, and also all the speakers providing good comments. Thank you very much.